Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We are going to be recording this webinar on data literacy and the next generation science standards in Maine for those of the participants and teachers who aren't able to make it to the webinar today. Realize this is the end of the school year and there's lots of things happening at this time of the year. So we will be recording this. And to get started then, so we have sort of two participants in this webinar. My name is Herschel Parikh, and I'm one of the founders of Tuva, and I have with me Dr. Molly Schaffler, who many of you in the Maine community already know. I'll let Molly do a brief introduction in just a couple of minutes. And over the course of the next hour or so, we're going to talk about a lot of really interesting and really essential things regarding data literacy in the context of the next generation science standards and just sort of what are the major challenges and problems and what are some of the solutions to help address these. Some housekeeping. So for those of you who have questions as we go along, please feel free to ask them by typing them in the questions tab. And what we will do is we'll address them towards the end of the session. We have allocated about 15 minutes for questions. But I encourage you to ask questions. There's a lot of interesting things coming up, and I'm sure that you'll have some questions regarding some of the content area that we'll be talking about. And we'll go through till about 6:05. So with that, then let's get started. Molly, do you want to come in and just give a little bit of an introduction about your work and your background, and we'll jump
Sure.
right into the content area.
Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. I do feel like I know a lot of you, even though I have no idea who is behind the screen I'm looking at. So many of you know that I and colleagues at the Schoodic Institute and at the University of Maine have been working for the last 5 or 6 years on this question of data literacy, or students essentially what do students do with data once they get it, and that's what we'll be talking about a lot today. We began our work with a math science partnership funding from the Maine Department of Education, and continued the work last year with some funding from the Davis Family Foundation, and it's been a wonderful 5-6 years now, and we're still on the path. And so I'm thinking of this webinar as sort of a first chance to spread what we've learned among the rest of many other teachers in Maine and even farther than Maine. So my colleagues at the Schoodic Institute, Bill Zellick and Hannah Weber, and then Sarah Nelson and Ryan Weatherby at the University of Maine have all contributed hugely to this work, along with about 15 or so of you, Maine math and science teachers. So I hope you guys can feel some sense of ownership that some of this work has come out of us. So I think that's, I guess we began with realizing that as we engage students in field research projects with scientists, that the students were great at collecting data. They loved it. They enjoyed that process and could get their data into a spreadsheet even, but what to do with it after that was a big challenge. And so that's what has led us to put together some of the things we have here. So Harshal, I don't know if you want to give your part of the introduction and then we can continue with this, or how do you want to
No,
do
I
that?
think we can continue forward. So just
Okay.
just where you left off, which is that really the goal of sort of this part of of the conversation is really to highlight why there's a need for data literacy, right? And then a lot of that sort of comes back from your research and observing how students do things with data, or what do they do with the data once they've collected it. And so it really does get to the point of, where is the need for data literacy in the context of NGSS, and what is some of the work that you have done to really sort of highlight the issue. And I think that's going to be really interesting to showcase. So here we are, where students have gone out, collected some data, and organized it into a simple spreadsheet. But really, as you mentioned, it's what happens next? What do I do with this? And sort of, I'll let you sort of take forward from there about what you've seen are some of the issues and major challenges that students face when they start thinking about exploring this data, visualizing this data, making sense of it, and going from there. So,
Okay. Yeah. So the first thing we realized was that students. One of the first things was students didn't really have a good idea of what kind of graph to make when they had a data set. And in fact, many times they weren't really clear about what kind of question they were asking. So we did a survey, and I'm just going to give you a little background because that'll help explain some of these slides. We asked students early on to graph some data. We gave them a small data set, and we asked them to graph it in a way that helped them decide if, in this case, two streams had different amounts of dragonfly larvae in them, rocky streams or mucky streams. And so really tiny data set of maybe 10 from each stream, 10 or 11. And we found that this kind of question of where students are asked to compare two groups, it's a really common question that students do in middle, high school, and even in undergraduate years. But they really had a hard time knowing what kind of graph to make. And I would say over 70 or 80% of the graphs were made as bar graphs, and over 60% of the students made graphs that didn't even resolve the data into two groups. So the students had really limited graph types that it occurred to them to make. So a lot of bar graphs, a few line graphs, even pie charts. And then we saw some really unconventional displays of data, and then some students didn't even graph anything. They just made a table and seemed to even struggle with that. So in the next image, I think you'll see some, when it came to the part of making a claim or making some sort of statement about the graph, we saw a lot of instances where students made really empty claims. My graph shows the differences in the number of dragonflies in each stream, and no labels on the graph as well. So and then we saw a lot of claims that were made that were really took leave of the data. A lot of conjectures that had nothing to do with the data. So those were those are some examples of what we saw when students were comparing groups. We also asked them to a question that gave them some data about fish and mercury in their fish weights and mercury found in the fish tissue. And we saw that many students were inclined to plot all of the data given. So there was a lot of extra data in this data set that they were given. So they tried to plot all of it in that upper left one. We saw a lot of instances where axes weren't scaled properly. So just the values for each number were plotted, but not scaled according to, and in fact, I think on that one you can see that the numbers are even out of order.
yeah.
And then a lot of confusion about when and how to connect points if you're making a scatter plot. And in the case on the bottom graph, the student connected the points in the order that they were given in the data set. So that, it was logical, but it wasn't appropriate for the graph. Yeah, and then in the next one, we saw some really more interesting unconventional displays, instances where the student on the top left didn't really perceive this as a three-dimensional space, and so plotted the values and then connected them with lines and actually concluded that these were related because the lines connected. So that was interesting. And then the bottom one, you have to really look at that a while, but it does have a certain logic to it, but again, it's not a conventional way to show, and it's not particularly easy to read. So, so this, made us think a lot about here are some of the problems students are having, but why are they having these problems? What do they need help with, and how is the best way to help them? So we thought of these are some of the big gaps that we realized. Students didn't seem to have any logical framework for how to decide what kind of graph to make to visualize their data. Bar graphs were the most familiar by far, and that's what we saw a lot of in all kinds of instances. Another thing that we noticed is some limitations in the software that they have to work with. So you'll see as we start talking about a framework that we've developed that looking at data, looking at variability in data is really key, a kind of a fundamental idea of how to make sense of data. Herschel, if you can scroll back to the slide before for a second. In math, a lot of times students are graphing points that all fall on a line, and they're given a table of points and they plot them and they all fall on the line. But when we deal with real data in the messy world, as the fish data set that we gave to these students, in the bottom graph, that student did a nice job of plotting the data points and plotted a best fit line, but the interpretation of the graph was that there was no relationship between mercury and fish size because all the points didn't fall on the line. So that suggested to us that there's a big difference in how data are used in math and how we use data in science, just in terms of language and how we visualize it and how we what we have to work with to graph it. So so visualizing variability, visualizing data as a distribution, and talking about those distributions in terms of variability is not something that most of the software that students are working with can do. Excel even doesn't make a dot plot, for example, or box plots very easily. So, so the software issue loomed large for us. The other was students didn't have a lot of words for describing data, especially for describing variability in data. So we've been thinking a lot about how to help them build some vocabulary around that. It doesn't have to be statistical vocabulary at first, but they do need words for describing shapes of distributions and things like that. There was a lot of uncertainty among the teachers that we met with. Many of them were science teachers and were unfamiliar with how to teach data skills, how to help students apply the particulars of math that they learn in math and statistics in the context of a scientific inquiry. So so that also loomed large, and actually, frankly, in the beginning, we were unsure about how to do this. So we've learned a lot along the way. And then the other missing thing was opportunities for using data regularly, ready-to-use, authentic data sets, hard to find, hard to put together, time-consuming, and so so we made a big effort to start generating some of those data sets and make them available. So so those are the big gaps that we saw. There were many, many little gaps small things, many of which we decided were probably pretty easy to fix if we had a sort of methodical way, or at least a coherent way to teach them. So let's see, where are we in the
So
slides?
this is really great, right? I mean, so what we have been able to do just through the last few slides is really be able to highlight, where are the major challenges when it comes to students whom we sort of call data novices, right? Because they don't have a lot of experience with data. What are the major challenges that students face in being able to do things with data and have a strong foundation in data literacy, as sort of we tend to call it, and and sort of on the flip side of that, we realize this is a problem, and some of the pictures that you showed in the slide of example student work really highlight some of the issues that exist, and these are sort of deep-rooted issues that can't be fixed in a day or a week. It has to be deeply ingrained in how teachers sort of deliver and integrate sort of data literacy concepts and the framework and all of that into their instruction, and how often students are getting an opportunity to use authentic data on a regular basis. So that's on one side of it. But there's another side of it, which is actually sort of looking towards what's coming, which is the role of data literacy in in sort of, and how it overlaps between the NGSS and Common Core, especially math standards, right? So let's talk about that a little bit, which is that not only are these major issues related to data literacy, but that the new set of standards with the Common Core and NGSS essentially demand that students know how to do this stuff really starting grade 3. So let's talk about that a little bit. And really, this is all laid out pretty nicely in one of the handouts, which is called Data Literacy in CCSS and NGSS version 0.1. So I'll bring that up. And Molly, I think it may be really useful to just walk through that a little bit, if not in great detail, certainly in our ability to sort of explain what the role of data literacy is in Common Core and NGSS. So here it is, and it would be great, I think, to spend some minutes, some time to go through this a little bit.
Yes. Let's see, I don't see it. Is it up?
Let me see. You should be able to see it now. Are you able to see it?
I don't.
Okay, interesting.
If other people can, maybe if it's just me, but.
Let me see, just give me 1 second. All right, so it seems like screen sharing is, how about now? I think it should work now.
Yes, there she is.
Great.
Okay. So originally we've mostly worked with middle and high school teachers in our workshops, and then we got Mary Finnemore and Kate Drummond talked their district into the elementary teachers having us come and give a workshop for the elementary teachers out at Skowhegan. So we did that, and that made us look at the data literacy standards earlier on, so grade 3 to grade 5. And elementary school is a great place to begin looking at essentially distributions of data, where students early on are asked to make pictographs and read pictographs, and maybe make human histograms where students stand in the place where their height is, or whatever, or whatever category they fall in. So displaying data in what's called in the elementary curricula line plots, we call later in 6th grade, they are referred to as dot plots. So looking at data in this way is a really great way to start, and I think many of us actually missed that connection. So grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5 are really, really good times to start looking at distributions of data in a very informal way. Grade 6 is where the Common Core math standards really begin to dive into some fundamental ideas in statistics and what you might call statistical thinking. So this is the stage where students begin to think about data as a group, with its own aggregate properties. So if you look at a data set, many students will say, well, which is the biggest, or which is me? But at this point, it's the Common Core suggests students should start using language around variability. So talking in terms of shape of a distribution, where the center is, and how spread out it is. In grade 7, that students begin to apply that language around variability in distributions to compare two distributions and decide if they're the same or different. And this becomes really, it's where frequency plots, box plots and dot plots, become really useful for students. And then in grade 8, correlations come into the picture. So a two-dimensional XY representation of data. So we're looking at is there a relationship or a correlation between two numeric variables? And then the idea of showing proportions as a pie chart, or showing percents of a whole group and how it's divided into subgroups. That's actually a 6th grade standard. So at this 6th, 7th, and 8th grade level, it's really making inferences, informal inferences about data. Some quantitative is beginning to come in. So then when you get to high school, the 9 through 12, it becomes much more quantitative, and the language becomes more around some of the mathematical aspects of data analysis. So that's kind of the vertical framework of on the math side. And then on the NGSS side, again, it's more applying those math skills in the context of generally analyzing and interpreting data, and generally constructing explanations. So drawing on all of these things to kind of put it down into a process of inquiry. And the sort of final section of this vertical handout that we made is, I think, is there one more? Yes, here it's the whole picture, and we refer to it as telling the story of the data. So this is where students kind of bring in all these skills, even ELA skills, to talk about what story is in the data in this sort of meaningful context, and it's the question that we were trying to answer. So that's our kind of synthesis of the pieces of the standards that seem really central to this process of data literacy.
Right. I mean, so I think what this sort of table with sort of the Common Core math standards and the NGSS practices laid out right next to each other, I mean, the message is pretty clear, and that is that fundamental concepts around data, measurement, graphing, the language around describing variability and other data and statistical concepts, and some of the more quantitative things that come in high school, there's a significant overlap between what students are able to learn in the math class and how they're able to apply it effectively in their science class. And I think that just sort of gets to the point of how data literacy as a notion is very much applicable across math, science, even ELA, as you mentioned. And so it's cross-curricula, cross-subject area. And so it's one of those things that has to be deeply embedded within the subject areas. It just can't be covered in just one subject area. There's just too much. It's got, excuse me. There's a lot of content. There's a lot of sort of fundamental concepts and skills that have to be deeply embedded into different subject areas across the curriculum, as opposed to sort of thinking that this is something that's part of the science purview or is part of the math purview. And I think that's one of the messages that we're seeing at Tuva as schools and districts are starting to implement this Tuva as a solution across the school, across the district, across subject areas. And I think that's a key component to this is that data literacy is one of those things that really falls in and is critical for many different content areas and something that we're going to continue to come back to, as we dig deeper and continue to do this work. So I think it's a really important thing that for a lot of teachers, it will be useful in terms of opportunities for collaboration and looking for ways to bring these concepts to their colleagues in the math department or the science department or other subject areas where it may seem appropriate. So I think that's a pretty good message that this sort of highlights for us.
And I would add to that, Harshal, that that's a real strength of the idea of data literacy because it is so interdisciplinary, but at the same time, it's been its problem because I think it really has fallen through the cracks because there's inconsistency among teachers within a school and colleagues and teaching teams about how to use and talk about data, and B, everybody thinks it's being done somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, and I think so. I mean, we've spent a good 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, really sort of highlighting what the issues are. So let's review them very quickly. The major issues that exist around sort of data literacy today are just the lack of understanding among students regarding what to do with the data once they've collected it, and the examples that you showed of some of the student work really highlights these challenges. And we'll make those slides available for anybody who really wants to see them and showcase them to their colleagues. Like, hey, here's the kind of research that is out there regarding sort of what the challenges are for students regarding what to do with the data once they have it at their disposal. And we also talked about, sort of just to wrap up this part, the importance of data literacy across NGSS and Common Core math, and just how deeply embedded it is, really starting grade 3, going all the way up to high school. So these are the challenges I think that we face as a community. And so I think we can sort of start talking a little bit about, okay, well, so what are the solutions, right? And you and I both know that the solutions that we're thinking about are not perfect. They're a work in progress. There's a lot of different aspects to being able to build the right resources and be able to provide the right technology and the data sets. So I think we can spend the remaining about 20 minutes or so really talking about how are we thinking about helping educators, schools, and districts address this challenge of data literacy for their teachers and students. And I guess it starts off with some of the resources that we have available, such as the data literacy framework, and some of the technology tools that we're developing at Tuva, and sort of the teacher resources and the whole ecosystem around it that we're working on. So let's start with the first sort of way how we think about this, which is a data literacy framework, and then that's right here. So I'll let you sort of talk about what this framework could look like. The framework itself, it will take a good 3-hour PD session for us to just go through the framework. So I think we can keep it fairly brief for now. But it would be great for us to talk a little bit about how this framework, how one can read this framework, and what are the different levels across the different columns, and what do each rows represent. So we can talk about the framework and then move on to some of the other resources that we're making available, including the technology, the graph choice chart, and some of the other ones. But we can start there and go from there.
Okay, so let's quick walk through this, just because you'll want to process it on your own. The columns on the left, the first column, approach to use of data, is just generally sort of where the different levels are. So let's start with level 1, because that's where a lot of students will need to begin. So first of all, just understanding what data is and what data sets are and what kinds of data there are, and then moving down to build an appreciation for an understanding of variability. Visualize it with frequency plots and describe those data distributions. Get the language to do that. And at level 1, it's described in that box there. And then move on to the skill of comparing groups. Comparing groups has actually emerged as one of the most difficult parts of this. Students are so used to just finding an average or a total and making 2 bar graphs that it's really hard to get them to shift from that to the idea of looking at distributions. So comparing groups, and then moving on to asking other kinds of questions of data. Questions about correlation or relationships, questions about change through time, and then questions about percentage of groups. And this involves making a choice about what kind of graph to make. And so we'll share with you in a moment a tool that we've created, the graph choice chart. And then the final row is just the skill of claim and reasoning. And there are many frameworks for developing skill in claim and reasoning, but it certainly is part of this whole process. So the levels across the top are just level 1. You might think of students just starting out, maybe in middle school. Level 2, their treatment of data can begin to get more quantitative. They can maybe begin working with larger data sets and more variables. And then level 3 you might think of as high school and beyond, where it's less exploratory and inferential and more what you might call confirmatory analysis, of maybe involves some statistical testing. So that's the gist of it, and take your time to look through it and at some point.
Yeah, and so this framework really is it's a way for one to think about where their students are in terms of their foundation around data literacy. Are they a level 1? Are they a level 2? I mean, there's no, it's not a black or white situation, but what we'll find most often is that students typically start off just at the very basic level 1 around their ability to do things with data. And here are some of the different categories of sort of topic areas that are relevant, right? So are they able to, what kind of data sets are they able to work with? You mentioned variability, the ability to compare groups, correlation and time series, and then their claim and reasoning, which also has a lot of literacy components to it as well. So it's a framework to think about where the students are and where they need to be as they move along from middle school into high school, or from elementary school into middle school. So it's a great way for one to sort of visualize and place where the students are and where they need to be. And there's a lot of work that we're doing to expand out on this framework. But I think this is sort of a really useful way to figure out, where are we today and where are we headed? Because it can be, one can get lost in the forest just trying to navigate the path. So this is sort of it lays out a path for us, this data literacy framework. And so from following up from there, you mentioned sort of a couple of things, right? So to be able to address some of the major issues around, well, what are, how do I start learning about variability? How do I start thinking about what kind of graph is the right one? So we have developed 2 resources around that. The first is the graph choice chart, and the second is the Data Literacy 101 course that we have released and developed on Tuva about 6 weeks ago or so. So let's go through briefly the graph choice chart, and then we can talk about the Data Literacy 101 course. And I think after that we'll have just a little bit more time to showcase some of the things that Tuva is doing, and then time for questions. So graph choice chart, Molly, this is on your end.
Okay, so some of you have seen an earlier version of this. This is not too different from that. So the idea here is that students were just deciding what kind of graph to make based on maybe what the last graph they made was, or what they're told to make. So we're a big advocate of not telling students necessarily what kind of graph to make. So the fundamental piece of this is that students need a really clear question to be um, tackling their data about. So what is your question? And it's whatever your question is going to determine what kind of graph you're going to make. And so this walks you through that. If you start with the boxes on the left, is your question about variability? Is it about comparing two or more groups to decide if they're the same or different? Is it about the relationship or correlation between two numeric factors? Or is it about how a total is proportioned or divided into subgroups? And from there, you can work to the right and hopefully be led to a kind of graph that would make sense for that kind of data. Now, this isn't total and perfect, and every single time it's going to, a line graph should be used when there's change through time. I think in physics, people don't always connect the dots. But this is a beginning framework. It's really to get students started on having a systematic way to think about their analysis and make some of these choices. So I think I'll stop there. I know this, again, it's another thing that takes some time to process.
Right. And so the graph choice chart, I mean, we think of it as sort of a reference resource that students can have with them, whether they're in a math class or in a science class, or really anytime they're doing anything with data, where, the idea is that they get into the habit of thinking, hey, what kind of question am I looking to answer? And based on my question, what may be an appropriate graph for it, right? To be able to visualize the data that I have, and move away from this notion that a bar graph is the right answer all the time. And that's one of those things that starts to tackle some of the things that you highlighted earlier, which is that, given any kind of data, 8 out of 10 students will typically try to represent it as a bar graph, even if that's not the most, effective way or the best way to do it. So this kind of resource could be used as a reference resource that one can have anywhere, anytime, to be able to get into the habit of thinking about what's the question that I'm looking to answer, and how can I, what's the right graph or visualization to help me answer that question. So I think it's a great way to sort of start thinking about that. And I guess the second resource that we mentioned, Molly, is the Data Literacy 101. Just to confirm, are you able to see that on my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a sort of a mini course that we have developed in collaboration with Molly, and just the idea is really that regardless of where students are coming in at what level, whether it's level 1, level 2, level 3, they have a sort of a resource on Tuva to go through this material on their own time, at their own pace, to engage with some of the fundamental concepts regarding data literacy, variability, and comparing groups, and looking at correlations and time series and interpreting data. So it sort of goes back to the framework. But really, Molly, do you want to add anything to, sort of the motivation to create this Data Literacy 101 course, and how can teachers sort of allow their students or enable their students to engage with the course materials, regardless of whether it's in class time or as homework or over the weekend, in terms of implementation and actually engaging with the material in this course?
Yeah, so I think when I started this project with Bill and Sarah and Hannah and Ryan, there's a lot of this stuff I hadn't looked at since I took statistics way long time ago, and so I myself didn't really have a very good way to think about data. I'll confess there. So I think it's true that's true for many of us who are science teachers, that we just don't have this all at our fingertips, this statistical thinking. So over the last 5 years, it just seemed like this wasn't just for students. It was also for other adults in the room that might feel not sure about how to think about data. So so we're piecing this together sort of as we go, and we really count on feedback from the folks who try it out. So the introduction, we've got a few lessons in the variability section, and I think this is really for anyone who wants to brush up on just the fundamental ideas. We designed it so students could work through it themselves. It is self-guided, so that's another nice feature, I think.
Yeah, and just as a heads up, for those of you who want to access the Data Literacy 101, it is made available in the resources section on Tuva. So if you go to resources, the first block you see is the Data Literacy 101 course. It is also accessible on your dashboard as well as your students' dashboard as soon as they log in. So we highly encourage all teachers to take the opportunity or give their students the opportunity to engage with the Data Literacy 101 course materials. The first thing once they start sort of engaging their students on Tuva, it's really fundamental, and our goal is to really build this out into a sort of the first resource for students to engage with really some of the essential materials that we have covered so far around variability, and just looking at things like developing their language around distribution and moving that on to comparing groups and into other kinds of questions on correlation and time series and things like that. So we really see this Data Literacy 101 course as a really foundational introduction to data literacy for their students. And right alongside the Data Literacy 101 on the resources section, there's also the graph choice chart in case you want to download it and print it off, make 30 copies of it, and distribute it out to your students first day of class, and really get into the habit, or encouraging them to get into the habit of asking the question and thinking carefully about what kind of visualization, what kind of graph makes sense depending on the questions that they're looking to ask. So all of these resources are available directly on the main resources section on Tuva. And sort of moving on from, so we've talked about graph choice chart, we've talked about Data Literacy 101, and the sort of the third part of the solution is really technology, and how can we develop tools and interfaces for both teachers to implement and integrate this kind of learning and thinking into their classroom, and how can students really engage with data in a very meaningful way. And that's really the work that we've been doing at Tuva for the last sort of couple of years now. And so we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just really quickly highlight what approach we have taken at Tuva really to drive this. And it really comes down to three really sort of critical components, right? So the first component to building a stronger foundation in data literacy is actually having great data sets to work with. And so here you'll see on the Tuva datasets library page, you'll see we're curating and putting together authentic, ready-to-use data sets across a wide array of Common Core and NGSS topics, lots of different subject areas. So this is sort of a place for you to find data for any really interesting topic, regardless of the subject area. And our goal is to continue to add and build out this library over the next coming months. So the library is growing. There's some wonderful data sets from NIH, from NOAA, from CDC, from the World Bank, and from a variety of different resources and primary sources out there. There are data sets from specific communities like Maine, like California, like Texas, like Maryland, and we're, again, putting together authentic data sets that are relevant to specific communities around the country and the world. So if you have specific requests, feel free to send them out to us. And really the framework sort of comes together in this little page here where you've got the data, excuse me, we're developing these research-based tools to enable the students to really explore the data, create different visualizations, and really make the data come alive and more accessible for the students. What they're really used to is this spreadsheet interface, which really is not the best way or the most accessible way for students to work with the data. A lot of research has shown that. So this sort of exploratory drag and drop interface where they can create a variety of different graphs and charts is really the best way for really sort of simple, fun way for students to start working with the data. So you've got data sets, you've got tools, and on the right side is really the main component, the learning, the activities, the lessons, the assessments that drive the inquiry for students and give them the opportunity to work with the data and answer questions. And all of these activities that we're developing are tied back to specific NGSS and Common Core standards. So really the Tuva component is the software or the technology component of the solution that is critical for teachers to be able to really enable their students to build a stronger foundation in data and statistical literacy, across the different subject areas as we talked about. So that's sort of the third component of the solution. So the first one is Data Literacy 101 course, which is right here. Second one is a number of our resources, including the graph choice chart and the pedagogy framework that we shared with you. That will also go up here very soon. And the third component is just technology and what the software, research-based software can do to really make this accessible and usable for students in the classroom. And there's going to be a ton more resources that we're going to make available around assessments, around instructional guides. So please keep an eye out for that as well. But this goes to show that there's not one sort of a silver pill to solve this issue. It's going to require technology. It's going to require professional development. It's going to require instructional guides and a lot of resources from us and Molly and her team and just the community to really come together and share these things to be able to really think deeply about how one can really start integrating and addressing the needs around data literacy in Common Core and NGSS. So resources are being developed to address these needs, but it's still, it's a work in progress, very much so. Molly, if you want to add anything to
Yeah, I would love to add to that it's very much a work in progress, and part of that progress comes from hearing back from you guys in the classroom about what's working and what isn't working. I think there may be some people on this webinar who have tried the graph choice chart, have used it on a regular basis, and it's just really great to hear from you how that works and what doesn't, and what we might need to change on it. So so teachers have played a central role in what we've developed, and I know on Tuva's side as well. So so we sort of welcome that kind of input. It's a very collaborative process, and really requires you're trying stuff out and taking some risks and seeing what works. So we love to hear from folks about that.
Yeah, and I guess one comment I'll add is that we are engaging with specific schools and districts regarding PD workshops, half day and full day workshops, even online workshops for those schools or districts where sort of a face to face implementation may not be possible. Really to help them start sort of building out this framework and how it can be implemented and integrated into their classroom environment and there is a plan to potentially roll this out over the summer in Maine and in other communities around the country, Texas, Arkansas, Virginia, and many other places. So again, if there's feedback that if there's thoughts that you have, if there's any additional sort of ideas that you may have for resources that we can look to develop, please feel free to reach out. But really, it's going to be a collective effort of professional development, great resources, and most importantly, tools and technology to really sort of bring this in a very meaningful, engaging way to the students, because it is coming. It is coming sooner than we think, and there's just there's a lot that we can do together to solve these fundamental issues around data literacy amongst our students. So that's a critical point. Um, so I
Can
think
I check in and see, do we have any questions from folks?
we have some, and I'm going to ask some of the other attendees if they have questions. Right now would be a great time to ask them. If you have any questions that for Molly or for me, or really in general, if you have a question out there for the community, feel free to pose them right now. One question that's already up there is from Laura, and that is, her question is, can we take the entire Data Literacy 101 course with the free version on Tuva, or do we need to purchase a full version? And so the answer is that you can take the entire Data Literacy 101 course on Tuva Basic on the free version. The Tuva Premium that is sort of made available here, you can find out more details about it on this page, is really around your ability to get access to our entire library of data sets, get access to premium content, get access to many of our premium resources and features, such as uploading your own data. But to answer your question, Data Literacy 101, which is right here, is entirely accessible and for you and all your students with the free account. And I encourage you to try it out. And it's a big course, and we're just, I would say, probably about a quarter of the way in, if not if not less. So over the next sort of upcoming weeks and months, we'll be continuing to release out additional lessons and modules that address these needs. So keep an eye out for that. But you and your students can go in and begin engaging with the Data Literacy 101 course materials today, and without having to need any Tuva Premium subscription or anything of that sort. Any additional questions? So while we wait for that, I guess, Molly, one question that I have that I know we talk about a lot is, let's talk a little bit about the NGSS and really just we've been talking about the NGSS assessments, the sample tasks that the NGSS have put out. Any initial comments from you regarding really the emphasis on data and being able to model and interpret data and analyze data, and just how critical of a role they're going to play in the NGSS in the coming years?
Well, yeah, I'll start by saying I am not an expert on the NGSS, and I think there are probably people on the call who are more knowledgeable about what is out there for assessing the standards assessment strategies. But I did do quite a bit of hunting for what people are using, and it seems early to be able to find much. The NGSS does have a series of data tasks that they have outlined in PDF, or more than outlined. They've created in PDF format I think the Achieve, those were created by Achieve and put on the NGSS site. So those data tasks are really about giving students a data set, or mainly actually just graphs, hard copies of graphs. And so we've been playing with the idea that this is a really useful kind of format to put these data sets in something more dynamic that students can actually play with and visualize the data in different ways, and maybe even filter it and look at parts of it. So we've created a couple of, we've drafted a few examples of how some of those NGSS assessment tasks could be used in Tuva in a more dynamic, interactive way for students. So I think I don't really know how the assessment of the standards is going to play out. I think we need rubrics for deciding where students are in their data skills and so forth, but that's all I think it's in process. So I don't know, maybe some of you have some more understanding of all of that.
Yeah, and then I guess it's going to depend on where the district's plans are as well. So and different districts will have different implementation timelines and things of that nature. But I guess the overarching sort of goal there was the just the importance of using authentic data for modeling and analyzing and interpreting data as an overall practice in the NGSS seems to be emphasized quite a bit, right? Is that
Mhm. Yeah, yes, and so habitually being able to take data and transform it into some coherent graph or visualization that um, constitutes evidence for either a question or a claim or to justify a course of action or a recommendation. That's the sort of big idea that we hope that all citizens in a democracy would be able to do, is to make kind of data-based or information fact-based decisions. And so I think it's that whole idea of turning data into evidence and then making claims about that, and then interpreting it and sort of justifying the reasoning. And so there are many parts to that process, and I think that's what we're striving for here. And I think NGSS is that's completely what they ask for in a lot of these performance-based standards.
right? And I think the goal. If you look at the where the big gaps slide again, we realize that there's sort of a number of major challenges that need to be addressed from a curricula framework perspective, software and tools, from the student's ability to work with the language, and really, how do we provide teachers with the appropriate resources and students with the appropriate uh, opportunities to work with data. And so I guess the overarching message is that there's a lot more that we need to do and over the coming months and years. And this is just sort of a beginning of how do we start thinking about helping our students build a stronger foundation in data literacy, by the time they reach high school, so that they're ready for bigger and better things, in their careers. So that's really the overarching goal here, right? Is that this is just the beginning. There's a lot that we want to address, and there's a lot of work that we're doing to make it happen. And really, it's going to be sort of hearing from the teachers of how they sort of where they're seeing the gaps and what kind of resources they think would be useful to help them make their lives easier, but still address some of the most critical needs that their students may have in the context of data literacy, for their math class, for the science class, and beyond. So that's really the overarching message of this, and what we wanted to go over in the webinar today.
Yeah, and I'll just say that it's not just high school and middle school students. We share our framework with our undergraduate teaching colleagues, and undergraduates needed, and so it's it's widespread.
Okay, great. So, you know where to reach us. You can reach me, Herschel at tuvalabs.com, or hello at tuvalabs.com. Molly's email is up here on the screen as well, in case you want to reach her regarding some of the work and research that her and her colleagues at the Maine Data Literacy Project have been doing. There's a lot to go over. We'll continue to be in touch. This webinar has been recorded, so we'll be sharing this out for those who weren't able to participate today. And we look forward to continue to engage, continue to hear feedback, and see how we can continue to build the right resources and the tools to help you build data literacy amongst your students. So, Molly, if you have any closing comments, feel free to make them.
Yeah, I think I'm all set, but please do get in touch if you want to talk more about this stuff, because we love to have these conversations.
Great. Okay. So thank you so much. Thanks, Molly, for taking the time to participate today. And we'll end the webinar, and we'll make the recording available in the next couple of days. So thank you so much for those who made it out today. and looking forward to next time.
Yep, thanks you all.